Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from Rao's IAS Study Cell. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Hindu newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 28th May 2020, and the articles that we are going to discuss are displayed on your screen. Now, in today's newspaper, most of the articles are not very important for us from the exam point of view. So, in this background, we will revise some very important topics for us from the exam point of view that we have already covered in the previous DNS videos. So, for example, today we will be discussing the important issues of the Forest Rights Act, the PISA Act, and also the background of the Hong Kong protests. So, let us start our discussion. Now, this article on page number 7 highlights the importance of improving the marketing infrastructure regarding the agricultural production in India. So, in this regard, this can be a very important topic for us from the General Studies paper 3 point of view. So, in this article, let us try and understand what are the issues that are affecting the agricultural marketing in India and what is the role played by the agricultural marketing in India in the first place. Also, after that, we will look at the evolution of agricultural marketing in India. And after that, we will look at the major problems in the agricultural marketing sector in India, and then what are the initiatives that have been taken by the government of India for improving or working upon these problems in the agricultural marketing sector. And if you go through the question paper of General Studies paper 3 of the mains examination of 2014, you will find that a question has already been asked related to the issues that affect the agricultural marketing due to the agricultural produce market committees that are set up under the various state government acts. And that is why this topic of agricultural marketing becomes very important for us from the mains examination point of view. So let us look at all the issues that affect the agricultural marketing sector in India. Now, we already know that agriculture is one of the largest enterprise in our country and it employs almost half of India's workforce. And in this regard, the government of India aims at doubling the farmers' income by the end of 2022. So in this background, it is said that poor marketing infrastructure in India is one of the biggest hurdles before the farmers for realizing the optimum prices on their agricultural produces. Further, we note that the agricultural production has been increasing continuously in the past few years. However, the increased agricultural production has neither benefited the farmers nor the end consumers. So, on the one hand, the farmers continue to get lower prices, and on the other hand, the consumers continue to pay more money for their consumption. And this has been attributed to fragmented agricultural market, lack of integrated domestic market, and restrictions which are imposed on the storage, movement, and the sale of agricultural commodities. So, in this background, let us look at the role which is played by the agricultural marketing for the farmers. Now, agricultural marketing in India has a much broader connotation and it includes all the activities in the procurement of farm inputs by the farmers as well as the movement of agricultural produce from farmland to the end consumers. Now, this covers broad range of activities which can include the storage, physical handling, transportation, primary processing, grading, packaging, and sale of agri commodities, etc. And that is why agricultural marketing involves all the aspects related to the agriculture. So, in this background, an efficient agricultural marketing system is extremely critical for the growth of agriculture sector in our country. So, the main role which is played by the agriculture marketing is that it enables the farmers to buy the agricultural inputs such as fertilizers, seeds, etc. at affordable prices. And this becomes important since the agriculture input costs have been increasing over a period of time. Further, it provides signals to the farmers with respect to the planning of sowing of the crops. And by making the use of market signals, the farmers would be able to grow those crops which are in high demand and get remunerative prices for the same. And a well connected and an efficient market would also be able to address the issue of food inflation, since it would be able to match the supply with the demand for the food products. Thirdly, an integrated domestic marketing system would considerably reduce the price variations in the agricultural commodities across India. And this would enable the farmers to sell their produce anywhere in India and they will be able to get the best prices for their agricultural produce. Further, according to a high-level expert committee which was constituted by the Ministry of Agriculture, it has estimated that 25 to 30% of the fruits and vegetables and up to 8 to 10% of the food grains are wasted annually due to lack of post-harvest technology and non-existence of integrated transport, storage and marketing facilities. And in this background, an efficient marketing infrastructure would enable the farmers to reduce their post-harvest losses So an efficient marketing infrastructure is important for reducing the post-harvest losses and also improving the incomes of the farmers. Further, in India, there is lot of scope for India to boost its export of agricultural commodities. However, India has failed to make optimum use of this opportunity, and in this regard, the agricultural marketing policies can act as an enabler for boosting the agricultural exports. So, what is the role played by the agricultural marketing? First is that it will make the agricultural inputs easily available for the farmers. Second is that it will signal the farmers as to which crop needs to be grown by them so that they can earn good prices for those crops. Further, if there is an integrated domestic marketing system, it will considerably reduce the price variation in the agricultural commodities across India, and also it will reduce the post-harvest losses and improve the incomes for the farmers. Further, it can also lead to boosting of agricultural exports from India. So these are few important roles which are played by the agricultural marketing system in India. So after this, let us look at the evolution of agricultural marketing system in India and what are the associated problems with this agricultural marketing structure. Now, post-independence, the government's focus was mainly on providing the markets to the farmers and also the platform to trade their agricultural produce. However, the main aim of the government of India was to keep the prices under control. And accordingly, most of the state governments have enacted the Agriculture Produce Market Regulation Act or the APMC Acts. Now, you might be knowing that agriculture is a state subject, and hence APMC Acts have been enacted by the respective state governments. Now, based on these APMC Acts, the state governments set up and regulate the marketing of agricultural produce. Now, apart from this, there are more than 22,000 rural markets or the Grameen Hats which are under the control of local bodies, panchayats and APMCs, etc. Further, besides this, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs declares the minimum support prices for certain agricultural commodities based on the recommendations of Commission for Agricultural Cost and Prices. Now, this minimum support price is intended to act as demand signal for the farmers so that they can take up the cultivation of appropriate crops based upon the existing demand in the economy. So, for example, the government of India declares the minimum support price for the crop of wheat. The farmers get the signal that they will at least get that minimum support price if they produce the wheat, and hence it provides them an idea as to which crop will fetch them good prices in the market. So accordingly, the minimum support price has also been designed. So this minimum support price incentivizes the farmers to invest in agriculture by assuring them of minimum returns. So that is the main role played by the minimum support price. So when we go through the existing agricultural marketing system in India, we find that there are Agricultural Produce Marketing Regulation Acts or the APMC Acts which are enacted by the state governments. Then there are rural markets or the Grameen Hats, and then there is the minimum support price which is announced by the central government. So after this, let us look at what are the issues that are faced by the agricultural marketing structure in India. Now, regarding the problems that are faced by the agricultural marketing in India, it is said that when India adopted the liberalization, privatization and globalization reforms in 1991, it was expected that the agricultural marketing would also be liberalized. However, the government failed to bring out reforms in the agricultural marketing in tune with the changed market environment. And agricultural marketing continues to be plagued by problems such as fragmented supply chain, poor marketing infrastructure, higher post-production losses, and lack of accurate or timely information system. So in this regard, the first issue is regarding the regulation of the markets themselves. And as we know that under the present APMC Acts, only the state governments are permitted to set up the markets. And the Act requires that the farmers' produce be sold only at regulated markets through registered intermediaries. And further, the Essential Commodities Act allows the central as well as the state governments to produce restrictions on the storage and movement of commodities which are deemed essential by the governments. So these regulation of the markets are themselves a problem in the agricultural marketing. Now, such kind of regulations have affected the private sector investment in the agricultural marketing infrastructure. And such restrictions also create artificial barriers and unnecessarily obstruct the free flow of agricultural commodities in India. And accordingly, the focus of the government has so far been on regulating rather than facilitating the agricultural trade. And the restrictions which are imposed by the APMC Acts and the Essential Commodities Act restrict the free flow of agricultural commodities in India. Further, there is fragmentation in the agricultural marketing structure in India, and there are about 2,500 regulated APMCs and around 5,000 sub-market yards which are regulated by the respective APMC acts in India. Now, apart from that, there are thousands of rural markets or Grameen Haats. And due to this fragmented marketing infrastructure, the agricultural commodities pass through multiple middlemen and traders who are operating in these APMCs. And this leads to the escalation in the cost of prices and prevents the farmers from getting remunerative prices for their farm produce. Now, in an ideal situation, the farmers should be allowed to sell their produce anywhere throughout India based on the prices which they get. And this can significantly improve their bargaining position and enable them to earn more incomes on their produce. And hence, the present fragmented marketing infrastructure goes against the interest of both the farmers as well as the consumers. So there is a need to develop an integrated domestic market by removing all the existing agricultural trade related barriers. Now, besides these hurdles which are created by the APMCs, there is issue of lack of access to these APMCs themselves. Now, adequate number of markets should be set up closer to the agricultural fields so that the farmers have access to APMCs. And this leads to decrease in the transportation cost for the farmers and also cuts down the post-harvest losses. And accordingly, the National Commission for the Farmers had recommended that each APMC should serve a market area of around 80 kilometers and it should be available to the farmers within a radius of 5 kilometers. However, if we look at the existing marketing structure, we find that an average APMC in India serves an area of around 450 square kilometers. And it highlights the poor access of the farmers to these APMCs. And on account of this, the farmers are forced to sell their produce at lower prices outside the APMCs to the intermediaries. So this highlights that the APMCs are not even accessible to the farmers because of the large area that they serve. Again, there is issue of imposition of multiple fees in the APMCs. Now, the APMCs charge market fee for the buyers as well as licensing fee from the traders. And apart from that, they also charge licensing fee from other agents such as the warehousing agents and loading agents, etc. And these multiple fees are estimated to be around 15% of the value of agricultural produce in some of the states. And these charges imposed have a cascading effect on the prices of the commodities, which adversely affect the end consumers. Further, the present agricultural marketing system is against the interests of the small and the marginal farmers. Now, almost 85% of the farmers in India are small and marginal farmers. And these farmers with lower marketable surplus find it difficult to aggregate their produce and sell it to the APMCs through auction. And hence, these farmers resort to sell their produce to local agents and traders at a much lower price. Further, another issue regarding the agricultural marketing infrastructure is that there is poor infrastructure of the APMCs. So even though the APMCs earn regular revenue through the imposition of mandi tax, the infrastructure in the APMCs such as the godowns, cold chain infrastructure, etc. continues to remain quite poor. And this leads to improper storage and consequently higher post-harvest losses. And most of the APMCs have not been able to set up electronic auction platforms which are quite important for offering the remunerative prices to the farmers. And finally, there is higher post-harvest losses, and according to a recent study, the total estimated loss in India is around rupees 92,000 crore. And the higher post-harvest losses could be attributed to fragmented market, lack of access to proper storage, and poor handling and transportation of the agricultural farm produce. So these are some of the problems or issues with the present agricultural marketing structure in India. Now, in this regard, let us look at what are the important initiatives that have been taken by the Government of India for handling the issue of agricultural market. Now, as we have seen that there are various issues which impact the agricultural marketing structure in India. So in this regard, the Government of India has recently created a Model Agriculture Produce and Livestock Marketing Act 2017. And this Model Act has been developed by the Ministry of Agriculture. And the Government of India has been pursuing the state governments to modify their respective APMC acts along the lines of this Model Agriculture Produce and Livestock Marketing Act 2017. So in this regard, let us look at what are the salient features of this Model Act which has been prepared by the Ministry of Agriculture. So first is that it provides for the freedom to the farmers to sell their produce outside the APMCs to the exporters, processors and end consumers. And we note that such kind of freedom is restricted under the existing APMC acts of the state governments. Further, it permits the private sector entities to establish new markets for the agricultural produce in any area which was earlier restricted by the respective state governments' APMC acts. Further, it also seeks to do away with the multiple levies and instead it imposes a single levy of market fee on the sale of notified agricultural commodities in any market area. So it tends to do away with the cascading impact of multiple fees which are levied in the agricultural mandis. Further, it does away with the need for multiple licensing requirements for the traders, and also it has proposed licensing of market functionaries which would allow them to operate in multiple markets. However, most of the states have not fully complied with the provisions of the Model APLM Act, and there has been general reluctance on the behalf of the states to amend their APMC acts to the tune of this Model Act which has been prepared by the Ministry of Agriculture. Further, it is being said that the provisions of this Model Act would not lead to the creation of a national or state level common market for the agricultural commodities. And this is because this Model Act states that even when the buyers are buying the agricultural produce outside the APMC area, they are still required to pay the APMC charges. And this acts as a barrier for the creation of integrated domestic market in India. Further, the government of India has initiated the National Agricultural Market or the ENAM. So in order to integrate the agricultural markets throughout the India, the government of India has set up the National Agricultural Market or NAM in 2016. And it is a pan-India electronic trading portal which seeks to network the existing APMCs through a virtual platform to create a unified national market for agricultural commodities. And thus this ENAM platform promotes better marketing opportunities for farmers to sell their produce through online competitive and transparent price discovery system and online payment facility. Now, even though the central government has started this ENAM platform, there are some challenges which are being faced in the implementation of this ENAM portal. Now, to implement the ENAM, every state government has to first amend its APMC Act to make a provision for the electronic auction as a mode of price discovery and allow a single license across the state and have the market fees levied at a single point. However, as we note that most of the states have failed to carry out these amendments, and thus the ENAM portal has not been able to provide benefits to all the farmers across India. So even though the central government has been coming up with various model initiatives, the state governments have been showing reluctance in adopting these initiatives. Similar such initiative is the initiative of contract farming. And the contract farming agreement is an agreement between the farmers and the buyers such as an MNC, wherein the buyers provide for necessary inputs such as the seeds to the farmers, and the farmers in turn agree to sell their produce at a predetermined price. And in this regard, the Model APLM Act provides for contract farming agreement to reduce the barriers to agricultural trade and ensure remunerative prices to the farmers. Now, although the government of India has provided for contract farming under the APLM Act, it faces multiple issues and challenges when it is implemented by the state governments. And in this regard, most of the state governments have failed to provide for contract farming in their APMC acts. And due to this, most of the time such an agreement is more of informal agreement between the farmers and the MNCs. And due to such informal nature of the agreements between the farmers and the MNCs, the interests of the farmers are not protected. And it has been observed at times that in order to cut their transaction costs, the MNCs prefer farmers who own huge land rather than small and marginal farmers. And hence the interests of the small and marginal farmers are not taken care of because the state governments have failed to provide for contract farming in the APMC acts. So this also highlights that the benefits of the contract farming has been reaching to only limited big farmers and it has not been able to reach the small and the marginal farmers. Further, another initiative is related to the farmer producers organizations or the FPOs. And these FPOs are an entity formed by the primary producers, for example, the farmers, milk producers, etc. And it provides for the sharing of profits or benefits amongst the members of such farm producer organizations. Now, the small and marginal farmers do not have the large marketable surplus and hence the formation of these FPOs by these farmers increases their bargaining powers and avoids the long chain of intermediaries to sell their produce directly to the end consumers. Now, in this background, the Union Budget of 2018 and 19 has announced a 5-year tax holiday and a small credit guarantee fund of rupees 100 crore for promotion of such farm producer organizations. And also, the central government has been encouraging the states to directly support the FPOs through various schemes. Again, we note that the government of India has launched a new umbrella scheme which is known as the PM Asha or the Pradhan Mantri Annadata Aay Sanrakshan Abhiyan. And this scheme has been launched by the government of India to ensure the benefits of MSP reach the poor and the small and marginal farmers. So by implementation of this scheme, it is expected that this would prevent the distressed sale of the commodities by the farmers and enable the government to fulfill its stated objective of doubling the farmers' income by the end of 2022. Again, the budget of 2018 and 19 had proposed to set up the Grameen Agricultural Markets or the GRAMs. And these were aimed at enabling the farmers to sell their agricultural produce without any restrictions which they presently encounter in the form of APMC imposed restrictions. And in this regard, the government of India has declared its intent to develop and upgrade the existing 22,000 rural hearts into Grameen agricultural markets. And these grams will be linked electronically to the e-NAM. And further, they will be exempted from the regulations of the APMC Acts, which will provide farmers the facility to make direct sale to the consumers and the bulk purchasers. So these are a few initiatives that have been taken by the government of India so far. So in this article, we have looked at the various aspects of the agricultural marketing structure in India, and also we have looked at the various problems which are faced by the agricultural marketing infrastructure in India. Further, we have looked at the important initiatives that have been taken by the government of India for resolving the issues with the agricultural marketing sector in India. So in this line, we note that India needs to enhance the production and productivity of agricultural produce in a sustainable manner so as to ensure the food and nutritional security. And that is why creation of an efficient and integrated domestic agricultural market is quite vital for the benefit of the economy. And this marketing system needs to address the challenges of high post-harvest losses and storage losses. Again, it also needs to address the issues of high marketing costs, inadequate market or procurement centers, and efficient storage and distribution of produce across the country. Further, the domestic agricultural market in India needs to be integrated with the foreign markets to ensure optimum benefits for the farmers. And the agricultural production has to keep pace with the population growth, consumers' preferences, and demand in the domestic and international markets by adoption of appropriate policies of market-led production. So some of the issues that we have discussed in this article are very important for us from the General Studies paper 3 in the mains examination. So do go through this, and with this let's take up the next news article now. Now this article on page number 5 is related to an important relaxation that has been provided by the Governor of Maharashtra regarding the implementation of the Forest Rights Act of 2006. So according to this modification to the Forest Rights Act 2006, the government has allowed the rightful claimants of the forest rights to appeal against the decisions of the district level committee. And this decision is likely to provide justice to those tribals whose individual or the community forest right has been rejected by the district level committee constituted under the Forest Rights Act. And further, this notification that has been given out by the Governor of Maharashtra applies to the areas covered in the Panchayat extension to the Scheduled Areas Act in the state. And we note that this is famously known as the PISA Act. So in this background, it is important for us to learn about the Forest Rights Act and the PISA Act in detail. And we have already covered the Forest Rights Act and the PISA Act in detail in a previous DNS video. So what we will do is that we will revise from that DNS video important aspects of the Forest Rights Act and the PISA Act, which can be very important for us from the preliminary examination point of view. And in that discussion, you will find that a lot of questions have been asked from the Forest Rights Act as well as the PISA Act. So let us revise the Forest Rights Act and the PISA Act. Now, if you go through the previous year papers of the preliminary examination, you will find that there were questions which are asked related to the Forest Rights Acts as well as the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996 or the PESA Act. So here you should note that there was one question that was asked in the year 2012 and there were two questions in the year 2013. So these acts which are related for the betterment of the tribal communities or the forest dwelling communities are important for us from preliminary examination point of view. So under this article, we will try to understand some basic facts related to the Forest Rights Act and to the PISA Act. And various provisions of these acts are important for us from preliminary examination point of view. And after this discussion, we will try to answer these questions which were asked in the preliminary examination in the previous years. Now, regarding the Forest Rights Act, you should note that in the colonial times, the control over forests was with the colonial government, and the traditional rights of the tribals and the forest dwelling communities were not recognized. Now, in the late 1990s, the government of India recognized that the tribal communities and the other forest dwelling communities have rights over the forest produce and the forest lands. So, in realization of these facts, the government enacted the Forest Right Act 2006. And this act recognizes the claims of tribals on the forest resources and ownership on the land. Further, this act grants legal recognition to the rights of tribals and other traditional forest dwelling communities. So, here you should note that it includes both the tribals as well as communities which are other than tribals or other traditional forest dwelling communities. So this fact is important for us from preliminary examination point of view because most of us can get confused with the term only tribals. Now various rights have been recognized under the Forest Rights Act. So let us look at these rights one by one. So mainly four types of rights have been recognized under the Forest Rights Act 2006. The first is related to the title rights, second is related to the use rights, third is the relief and developmental rights, and fourth are related to the forest management rights. Now, under the title rights, ownership to the land that is being farmed by the tribals or other forest dwellers has been provided. And this ownership of land has been subjected to a maximum of 4 acres. Further, regarding the ownership rights, you should note that ownership is only for the land that is actually being cultivated by the concerned family, which means that no new lands can be granted under the Forest Right Acts. So, only those communities will have rights or title rights which have been farming or cultivating the forest land for considerable period of time, which means that no new allocation will be granted under the Forest Right Act 2006, which means that it recognizes only the traditional rights of tribals and other forest dwelling communities. The second is related to the use of forest produce. The ownership of minor forest produce has been provided for the tribals and other forest dwelling communities, which means that major forest produce like timber, etc., are still controlled by the government, and the rights over these major forest produce have not been provided to these communities. Then there are relief and developmental rights under this act. So this act provides for rehabilitation in case of illegal eviction or forced displacement. It also provides provisions related to basic amenities, and all these relief and developmental rights are subject to restrictions for the forest protection. The fourth rights are related to the management of forest. So in this line, the rights of tribals and other forest dwelling communities have been provided to protect the forests and the wildlife, because the forests and tribal communities have been known to live in harmony with the forests and the wildlife. So the points that are important for us from preliminary examination point of view are that under the Forest Right Act, legal recognition of traditional rights have been granted to tribals as well as other forest dwelling communities or other traditional forest dwelling communities. Secondly, it provides for ownership or title rights in forests only to those communities which have been traditionally cultivating land in the forest areas. And this means that no new land can be granted under this act. Further, the act provides for control or ownership over the minor forest produce, which means that it does not provide for ownership or control of major forest produce. And thirdly, it provides relief and developmental rights, which means that it provides rehabilitation in case of forced displacement, and it also provides rights related to the management of forests. Now after this, let us understand who all are eligible for these rights under this act, and also who decides as to who gets the recognition of title rights under the Forest Right Act 2006. Now who all are eligible for rights under the Forest Right Acts? So those eligible include those people who are residing in forest or forest lands and depending on forest and forest land for a livelihood. Secondly, the claimant must be a member of scheduled tribe in that area, or the claimant must be residing in the forest area for 75 years at least. So these are the two criteria which define the rights or ownership rights under the Forest Right Act. So only if a claimant is a member of scheduled tribe or he has been residing in the forest for 75 years. Now who decides these rights? So in this line, the Gram Sabha recommends whose rights should be recognized. So everyone who is claiming rights in the forest under the Forest Right Act are decided or recommended by the Gram Sabha. So all these points that we have discussed are important for us from preliminary examination point of view. Now after understanding key facts related to the Forest Right Act, let us understand key features of the PESA Act. Now the PESA Act was passed in 1996 and this PESA Act means Panchayat Extension to the Scheduled Areas Act 1996. So this means that the PESA Act of 1996 is applicable only to the 5th schedule areas. Now here you should note that the 6th schedule areas are not included under the PESA Act. This is because the 6th schedule areas already have various provisions for the protection of the tribal communities in those areas. And these provisions have been provided in the constitution itself. For example, the 6th schedule provides for district councils, regional councils, etc. However, to extend the provisions of Panchayati Raj institutions to the 5th schedule areas, the PESA Act was enacted in 1996. So this means that the provisions under the PESA Act are different from the provisions which are provided in the Panchayati Raj Institutions Constitution Amendment Act of 1992. Now let us look at some salient features of the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996. So this act provides that the legislation can be enacted by the state governments on panchayats in the scheduled areas or the 5th schedule areas. And these legislation on the panchayats or the Panchayati Raj institutions in the scheduled areas shall be in conformity with the customary law, social and religious practices, and traditional management practices of the community resources. Which means that these Panchayati Raj institutions in the scheduled or the 5th schedule areas should be in conformity with the traditional laws of the tribal communities. Secondly, it provides for the area which should be included as a Gram Sabha. So in this it provides that habitation or a group of habitations or a hamlet comprising a community and managing its affairs in accordance with the traditions and customs and shall have a separate Gram Sabha. So this provides that the grouping of areas under the Gram Panchayat shall be done in accordance with those people who are managing or those communities who are managing its own affairs in accordance with the traditions and their customs. Thirdly, every Gram Sabha will safeguard and preserve the traditions and customs of people, their cultural identity, community resources, and customary mode of dispute resolution. And finally, the Gram Sabhas in these areas will have roles and responsibilities in approving all the developmental works in villages, identify the beneficiaries, and issue certificates for the utilization of funds. So in short, all the activities that are undertaken in the Schedule 5th areas in the Panchayati Raj institutions should be in accordance with the traditional or the customary laws of tribal communities. Now under this PESA Act, the Gram Sabhas and Panchayats have been provided with powers to regulate certain things. And these are compulsory provisions under the PESA Act. So these are very important for us from preliminary examination point of view. So in this line, the Gram Sabhas or the Panchayats will have powers to manage. So this term minor water bodies is important here because they will not be able to control major water bodies like dams, etc. Secondly, the Gram Sabhas have power of mandatory consultation in matters of land acquisition in those scheduled areas or the Gram Sabha areas. Thirdly, the Gram Sabhas have power to control institutions and functionaries in all social sectors and local plans. Fourthly, the Gram Sabhas have power for resettlement and rehabilitation and prospecting licenses or mining leases for minor minerals, which means that in case of lease or licensing of major minerals, the Gram Sabha does not have any power. Fifthly, it has power to prevent alienation of land and restore the alienated land. The land cannot be taken forcefully from the tribal communities in these areas. And in these areas, if such land has been taken, the Gram Sabha has the power to restore such alienated land. And finally, the Gram Sabha will have power to regulate and restrict the sale or consumption of liquor. They have the powers of managing village markets, controlling money lending to the scheduled tribes, and ownership of minor forest produce. So all these points on this screen are very important for us from preliminary examination point of view. Now let us look at the questions which were asked in the previous year. Now this question was asked in the year 2012 in the preliminary examination. The question reads, in the areas covered under the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996, what is the role or power of Gram Sabha? The first statement reads, Gram Sabha has the power to prevent alienation of land in the scheduled areas. Now, as we have learned, this power is with Gram Sabha. So, this is a correct statement. Second statement reads, Gram Sabha has the ownership of minor forest produce. So, you should notice the term minor forest produce here. And this is also a correct statement. The third statement reads, recommendation of Gram Sabha is required for granting prospecting license or mining lease for any mineral in the scheduled areas. Now, this statement is incorrect because as we have read, the Gram Sabha only has powers relating to licensing of minor minerals in those scheduled areas. Hence, the correct answer here is B, that is 1 and 2 only. Now, these two questions were asked in the year 2013. This question reads, the government enacted the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act in 1996. Which of the following is not identified as its objective? The first option is to provide self-governance. This statement is correct because it provides for Gram Sabha, which will deal with all the local developmental plans in that area. So it provides a provision for self-governance. Secondly, to recognize traditional rights. Yes, it provides traditional rights like ownership and management of various rights relating to minor forest produce, etc. So this is also correct. The third is to create autonomous regions in tribal areas. Now this statement is incorrect. And finally, to free the tribal people from exploitation. This statement is also correct because the PESA Act provides for various rights to the tribal communities in this area through the Gram Sabha. Now the question has asked which one of the following is not identified as its objectives. So in this case, the correct answer that you should take is C. That is, the third provision has not been provided as an objective of the PESA Act 1996. Another question that was asked in 2013 is, under the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Right Act 2006, who shall be the authority to initiate the process for determining the nature and extent of individual or community forest rights or both? Now, as we have learned, this right rests with the Gram Sabha. So the correct answer is Gram Sabha. Now, as we have seen, all the provisions of the Forest Right Act and the PESA Act are important for us from preliminary examination point of view. So you should go through these points that we have discussed in the article in detail. Now, both these acts that we have discussed here are also important for us from mains examination point of view. As you can see, in the year 2017, there was a question which reads, what are the two major legal initiatives by the state since independence addressing the discrimination against the scheduled tribes or the STs? So both these acts are important for us from mains examination point of view as well. And this question was asked in the General Studies paper 1 of the mains examination in the year 2017. And with this, let us move on to the next article. Now, this article on page number 6 is related to the China's effort to pass the national security law. And it has been trying to impose this national security law on the city of Hong Kong. Now, various aspects of the new security law that is being imposed by China on the Hong Kong have been discussed in the Daily News Simplified of 23rd May 2020. And as we are covering this news, China has already passed this national security law which will be imposed on Hong Kong. And we note that protests have already started in Hong Kong because of the imposition of this new security law by China. However, what we will do in this article is that we will revise from a previous DNS video where we have covered the important aspects of the historical relations between China and the Hong Kong, or what has been the historical context of the present protests that are happening in the city of Hong Kong. Again, we will look at what is the importance of Hong Kong for India in terms of economic trade. So let us revise from that previous DNS video as to what are the important issues that are concerning Hong Kong and why are the protests happening in Hong Kong presently. So first, let us look at the Hong Kong issue from the historical perspective. So here it should be understood that the Hong Kong was acquired by Britain after defeating China in the Opium War. And this Opium War between China and Britain started because the Qing dynasty in China attempted to crack down on the illegal opium trade, which was leading to widespread addiction in the China. So after being defeated by the Britain in 1842, China agreed to cede the island of Hong Kong to British in perpetuity through a treaty known as the Treaty of Nanjing. And over the next half century, UK took control of other neighboring islands of Hong Kong, which is known as the present day Hong Kong. And finally in 1898, through a convention, The Hong Kong territory was leased to Britain for 99 years. And under the terms of this treaty, China would regain the control of the leased islands on July 1st, 1997. Now, as the British relations with the Hong Kong territory date back to 1840s, similarly, because India was a part or a colony of the British Empire, that is why India's relations with the Hong Kong also date back to this period of 1840s. So before the end of this 99-year lease, the Britain and China signed a joint declaration on the future of Hong Kong in the year 1984. And under this joint declaration, a new system of administration was to be designed for Hong Kong. And this was known as one country and two systems approach. Now, under this system, this British controlled territory was handed over to China and the Chinese sovereignty extended to Hong Kong. However, the territory of Hong Kong retained its original political and economic system. And regarding this, the political process in Hong Kong was to be guided according to the province's basic law. Now, this system of Hong Kong has two special features. The first is that the socialist system and the policies that are being practiced in China will not be extended to Hong Kong. And this Hong Kong special administrative region will have the same capitalist system which it has been practicing for past 50 years. And this will be the way of life in Hong Kong for coming next 50 years. Now, besides the capitalist system that will be practiced in Hong Kong, there will be a chief executive who will be the highest representative leader in Hong Kong. And he shall be selected by election or through the consultations held locally and will be appointed by the Central People's Government of China. Now, here it is to be understood that the person who will stand for the elections of the chief executive will be first nominated by a nominating committee. And these nominations are presently being done by the central government of China. So, after the candidates for the chief executive are nominated by the Chinese government, these people stand for elections and one of them is appointed as the chief executive after the election process through the universal adult suffrage in Hong Kong. So in short, China nominates who will stand for this position. However, the final selection or election for the chief executive is done through the voting from the people of Hong Kong. Now after this, let us look at the current position and significance of Hong Kong. So in this line, let us first understand the geographical significance of the location of Hong Kong for China. Now the Hong Kong forms a part of the Pearl River Delta metropolitan region where the Pearl River flows into South China. So as you can see in this map, the Hong Kong is located at the mouth of South China Sea. Further, it is the wealthiest region in South China and the largest urban area in the world in both size and population. Further, it includes major economic centers such as the Guangzhou, the Shenzhen, Macau, etc. And its GDP is at $1.2 trillion, which makes it the largest economic region in Southeast Asia, which is even more than Indonesia. So it has economic significance, and besides this, it has the location which is very important for China, and this is because it opens into the South China Sea. Now let us understand why are protests going on in the Hong Kong and what is the present cause of tension between China and the Hong Kong. So first is related to the election of the chief executive in the Hong Kong. Now, as we have learned that the Chinese government nominates the individuals who can stand for the chief executive in Hong Kong. Now, in this background, the China wants its control on the nomination process, wherein China nominates only pro-Chinese government individuals that do not critique the Chinese policies in Hong Kong. Now, the protesters or the activists are pro-democracy and they want a more direct election process in Hong Kong. And they want that there should be no interference or control of China on the elections of chief executive of Hong Kong. Now, before 1997, the economic scenario was very different. And at that point of time, Hong Kong was the main investor in the mainland China. However, presently, after 20 years, the situation has now changed and China has become an economic superpower. And that is why the Chinese control over the Hong Kong is increasing economically day by day. Further, another cause of tension between China and Hong Kong is related to the cultural differences between Hong Kong and China. Now, the people in mainland China are Mandarin speaking. However, the Hong Kong is a Cantonese speaking region. So the languages in both these regions is different. So they are linguistically very different, and which shows the cultural differences between China and Hong Kong. And finally, the Hong Kong considers itself culturally distinct from China, like other countries of the Indo-China region. So the issues are mainly related to the election system of the chief executive of Hong Kong, wherein the interference of China has increased and China wants to retain its control on the nomination process so that they can appoint a person who is pro-China. And by that, they can indirectly control the Hong Kong's government. And as against this, the protesters are demanding that the process of election of the chief executive should be democratic in nature and there should be no interference of China in this process. And finally, let us look at the India Hong Kong relations. Now, in this line, you should note that India respects and follows the one nation, two system policy between China and Hong Kong. Now, both China and the Hong Kong follow two separate economic systems. And in this line, India has signed separate agreements with China and with Hong Kong. So, in this background, India has signed the double taxation avoidance agreement with the Hong Kong. Now, since Hong Kong has always had liberal economic policies, it has always acted as a gateway to China for the companies in the rest part of the world. Now, what this means is that various companies of the world used to invest in Hong Kong, and through Hong Kong, they used to invest in China. Now, with rapid growth and engagement between the Chinese and the Indian economies, now the Hong Kong is also acting as a gateway to India. This is because India has signed a double taxation avoidance agreement with Hong Kong. And that is why many Chinese companies are routing their investments into India through the Hong Kong. Further, Hong Kong is a major re-exporter of the items it imports from India into the mainland China. Now, India is Hong Kong's third largest export market destination after China and US. And also, Hong Kong is India's third largest export market after US and UAE. Further, Hong Kong occupies 12th position in the FDI equity inflows into India in the year 2018. So this shows that Hong Kong remains a very important partner for India as far as economy is concerned. Further, India has had cultural engagement with Hong Kong, and it should be noted that Hong Kong has for more than 150 years been home to a large Indian community. And this Indian community in Hong Kong has contributed to the oldest university in Hong Kong, which is known as the Hong Kong University. And several Hong Kong based persons of Indian origin have been awarded by the Pravasi Bharati Samman Award. So, all these things highlight that India has got important economic as well as cultural relations with the Hong Kong. So, all these aspects show that India has had very good economic relations with the Hong Kong, and it is one of the important economic partners for India. And if due to Chinese intrusions, the Hong Kong economy is impacted, it will have repercussions for Indian economy as well. So these are few aspects of the Hong Kong protests and what are the issues that are going on in Hong Kong. With this, let's move to the next article. And with this, we conclude today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day.